Hi there, I'm Sarah Haggerty. I'm a conservation biologist with Maine, Audubon. I'm a conservation biologist with Maine Audubon. Maine Audubon is a nonprofit conservation organization, and our mission is to conserve Maine's wildlife and wildlife habitats through outreach, education, and advocacy. I want to talk to you today about StreamSmart road crossings, and we'll get a little bit into basic project design as well. StreamSmart is not solely a Maine Audubon project. It is a true partnership project. And the partners in StreamSmart are made up of federal agencies, state agencies, local towns, other nonprofit organizations, private landowners, and others. And the focus of this talk today is to give you an overview of the StreamSmart program, focusing on understanding how streams work, as well as how to construct road stream crossings that promote healthy wildlife and lasting road infrastructure. The goal of StreamSmart crossings is to maintain fish and wildlife habitat while also protecting roads and public safety. By building StreamSmart road crossings, this is what we're trying to avoid. Obviously, road failures like this are bad for fish and wildlife, they're bad for budgets, they're bad for public safety. And unfortunately, the likelihood of failures like this is increasing as large annual storms become bigger and occur more frequently over time. Besides avoiding catastrophic road failures, StreamSmart crossings can help us restore free-flowing streams. And free-flowing streams are important for a number of reasons, one of which is fishing. Fishing is one of the most popular sports in the nation. And Maine has world-class fisheries. People travel here specifically to go fishing. Fishing is a multi-million-dollar industry in Maine. And there's good reason people come here to fish. For one, Maine supports the last remaining large intact populations of wild brook trout in the eastern US. The map on the left shows the historic range of the eastern brook trout, with the red areas denoting the areas with the most degraded habitat, and the purple areas showing where the habitat is most intact. As you can see, Maine has the most extensive, highest quality habitat available. The map on the right, the dark blue areas are where brook trout populations thrive in the absence of competing non-native salmonids like brown and rainbow trout. But there are gaps in occupied habitat, the areas that do not have color, and these are mostly not occupied because of the fragmentation caused by roads. Maine is also home to the only remaining populations of wild Atlantic salmon in the United States. The map on the left shows the historic salmon rivers. Atlantic salmon used to run in all the major rivers east of the Hudson River in New York. They were in all of the New England states. Now, this anadromous fish only returns in very small numbers to the major rivers of Maine. Born and raised in cool freshwater streams, this fish travels thousands of miles out to sea, where they then feed off the coast of Greenland for a couple of years, and then they return to the very streams where they were born, but now they've come to spawn and reproduce, which just goes to show that fish need to move. Fish of all species need to move. They need to move daily, they need to move seasonally, and they need to move throughout the different life stages that they go through. Daily, they need to find food, they need to find shelter, they need to find areas of rest. Seasonally, they need to be able to find cool streams where they can go to escape the heat and the low flow areas during the summer months. And they need to be able to find deep pools where they can overwinter without freezing. Throughout their lives, they occupy very different areas. When they're small, they're in small streams where larger fish can't prey on them. And as they age, they move out of these smaller streams and take advantage of other available habitat as they grow. They may travel fairly far from where they were born, with fish like salmon traveling all the way out to sea and back again. Because of this intrinsic need to move, connected, unfragmented streams are critical for their very survival. But free-flowing streams don't just benefit fish. They benefit everything that supports the fish, like invertebrates and microorganisms. They support the organisms that might feed on the fish, like fishers. And they benefit other species that rely on the streams. Freshwater mussels filter water and provide food for other organisms. Terrestrial species often use stream corridors and riparian areas as their travel corridors. And when they reach a road stream crossing that does not allow passage, does not allow them to go through, they often end up, their only choice is to go up and over the road. And it is often, the result is disastrous for them. But it's not just about the critters, it's also about the functions of the stream, what the stream does. A free-flowing stream regulates the flow of water, which helps mitigate storm flows and flooding events. Free-flowing streams maintain water temperatures. Free-flowing shady stream is cooler than a slow-moving, sluggish body of water. And that cooler water holds more oxygen, which is good for all sorts of aquatic species. And free-flowing streams also move materials, boulders, sediment, root wads, trees. They all move when we have these large storm surges. And when the stream is free-flowing, those materials are deposited out and distributed throughout the system as the water moves. And it's these structural elements that create the best habitat for fish and other aquatic organisms. So we've covered why free-flowing streams are important. What's the problem? The problem is barriers. We tend to think of dams when we think of barriers to fish passage, and they are a huge problem. But there are more road stream crossings acting as barriers than there are dams on the landscape. Culverts have traditionally been created from the road perspective. We're trying to move water through a road. We're trying to change the way that we think about that and try and think about it from the perspective of the stream and think about it as a road crossing a functioning stream. Stream smart designs can meet our transportation needs and still allow the stream to flow freely and allow fish and wildlife to move. So how do culverts block fish passage? There are three basic problems. The first is that they can create high flows. The water can flow too fast for fish to swim through, and this can happen either through undersized culverts or culverts that are set too steeply. The second problem is that you often end up with water flows within the culvert that are too shallow for fish to move through. This can happen when the culvert's set too high and it acts like a dam, and not enough water can actually get in and get through the culvert. And finally, the culvert itself can create a physical barrier to passage, either with a perched or hung culvert, where the outfall of the culvert is set well above the stream bed, or it ends up above the stream bed, or the inlet on a too small culvert can become easily blocked by debris or by beavers, or the culvert can actually create a thermal barrier to fish movement. When that culvert is set too high and acts like a dam, it creates a backwater behind it. That water kills the trees, so you have less shading. You have siltier, smaller substrate settling out on the bottom of the water. That water heats up, it's not moving. And if it reaches temperatures that are too high, then cold water species like brook trout and Atlantic salmon can't function in those temperatures. They won't even go into it, even if they have access through the culvert. So you create a physical barrier based on the temperature when the crossing structure is set in properly. Usually what you find is a combination of these problems. You can have a high flow culvert that ends up too shallow in the low flow time of the year, that's perched or is blocked. It's often compounded effects. So I want to go a little bit into how an undersized culvert constricts stream flow and becomes perched. So the diagram at the top is as if you're looking down at a culvert. So you can see the wide stream being squeezed together into a smaller pipe. And when you take all that energy of the wide stream, you push it through the pipe, all that energy creates increased speed and velocity through the culvert. When it gets to the other end of the culvert, all that energy is released and it has to go somewhere, and that extra energy creates turbulence at the end of the culvert, and that turbulence scours away at the stream bed. And over time, you can end up with a plunge pool, and you can end up with a culvert that's perched or hung above the stream bed. We don't put them in 2 feet above the stream bed. They end up that way when they're undersized. And often what happens is the materials that are dug out of that plunge pool end up pushed up on the far side of the plunge pool, creating yet another barrier for fish trying to move through the system. And it can happen quickly. This is an example of a crossing structure in Blanchard. It's a concrete box culvert. And it was put in the mid 2000s, and a few years later, it already had a perch developed. 2 years later, that perch was dramatically larger and creating a barrier to fish passage. You'll also notice inside that box culvert, there's no channel, and so the water sheets across the concrete, making it too shallow for fish to swim through. This can happen very quickly. And this is what failure looks like with a real example. This is a road crossing failure in the town of Freeport in 2008. It's an undersized culvert. There's a large storm event, debris blocked it, and you can see what happens next. Here's the culvert coming through the opening. This is what we're trying to avoid. And fortunately, we have the tools to reduce the probability of that happening. There are things we can do. Stream smart crossings can maintain fish and wildlife habitat and also protect roads and public safety. In this photograph, you can see the naturally flowing stream going right through the culvert, the crossing structure. You even have dry banks on the sides, which allow wildlife to pass without having to go over the road. And it also is creating enough capacity for those larger storm events, which is a good thing because there was a 50 to 75 year storm event in 2010, right after this crossing was put in. This is that same crossing structure, nearly filled to capacity, but not overtopping. This structure was intact and fine after the storm. Multiple other crossing structures were washed out, roads were washed away, but the Stream Smart crossings had the extra capacity to take those large storm pulses. So, how do we know if our crossing is Stream Smart? What features should we look for or include in our own designs when we're trying to create a Stream Smart crossing? Well, we tried to boil it down to the most important points for Stream Smart outcomes. If your project meets these criteria, then you probably have it right. These are indicators of success. The specific structure type that you use to achieve these goals doesn't matter as much as really hitting these goals. You need to use what's best for your situation. A forester on a spur road would use something different than is what's used on a busy road downtown in a municipality. But if we follow these rules of thumb, we'll pass the floodwaters, the fish, and the sediment that we need to. So we narrowed it down to the 4 S's, and they are span the stream, set the elevation right, make sure the slope matches the stream, and make sure you have substrate in your crossing. So let's run through them. A Stream Smart solution lets the stream be a stream and avoids pinching or constricting the stream. You can see in this photo that the culvert pinches the stream. The stream's wider upstream and downstream of the culvert. A culvert is a static structure within a dynamic system. Streams like to move vertically and horizontally over time, but culverts do not. This is the same picture we saw before. This is the actual structure that replaced that undersized culvert. Again, you can see the natural flow of the stream, enough capacity, as we saw for those large storm surges. And in normal flows, you have dry banks so that wildlife can move through the crossing structure without having to go over the road. So to size something so that you span the stream, the rule of thumb is use a rough estimate of 1.2 times the bankful width of your stream. What that means is you add another 20% to the width of your stream at high water, and that will give you the extra capacity that you need to pass those large storm events and also provide dry passage for wildlife. The second S is to set the elevation right. Notice this culvert is not blocked at all, but you can also see there's a lot of water up above it, but there's no flow in the culvert. The pipe was set too high for this stream, and it's created a dam-like effect. There's a backwater up above this culvert, and very little water is moving through. A good way to assess your elevation is to stand on the road at the crossing and look upstream and look downstream. And if they look different, like they do here, and your inlet and outlet, your culvert is not blocked, and we can see in these pictures there's nothing blocking this stream crossing, then you probably have an elevation problem. Here's an example of a crossing structure that is at the right elevation. You're standing on the road looking upstream and downstream. The flows are the same, the amount of water moving through in a particular amount of time, and the substrate, the gravel, the boulders, the cobble, the size of the structure, they're the same above and below. And you set your elevation or determine your elevation by doing a stream profile. You have to actually go out and take measurements. You cannot use estimates or modeled numbers. You need to actually collect some data. So what you do is you go out to the stream and you measure the high points and the low points and the high points and the low points going up and down the stream, up above and below your crossing structure. And then when you connect those dots of the high points, you get your stream slope. And when you collect the low points, you can find the elevation. Now notice, you can sort of ignore the plunge pool at the outfall of the culvert because that's an anomaly that is created by the crossing structure. That's not a normal scour depth that the stream would normally have. So that's what the low points are. They're the natural scour points, and you want to make sure that your new culvert is large enough and is set low enough to be below the natural scour line. If it's set too high, the stream can scour out from under your culvert. We actually walk through this in our StreamSmart Phase 2 trainings. They're 2-day workshops. We usually hold them in the fall, and we actually take you out to a stream and you actually collect these data points and then put them into software and create a preliminary design. So you actually get to try it out. So if you're interested in actually getting some practice with that, then sign up for some of our Phase 2 workshops in the fall. You take the data and you actually put them into a program, and it can calculate these, but you can also just use graph paper and get these elevations and slopes as well. The third S is to make sure the slope matches the stream. You want to install the culverts so that there's no change in the stream bottom, in the inlet and the outlet. So you have seamless inlets and outlets. You don't want a lip or a dip. You want it to be the same coming in and going out. Like with elevation, you're trying to mimic the stream in the slope that you set for your crossing structure. And finally, you want to make sure that there is natural substrate in the crossing. Substrate is the material that lines the stream bottom. It's boulders, it's cobble, it's gravel, it could be sand. Whether it's the existing substrate in an open bottom crossing or substrate that you've added to an embedded structure, Stream Smart crossings need to have substrate. This maintains the natural rate of flow of the stream, helps oxygenate the water, and provides habitat to allow for fish passage. You need to make sure that your substrate matches the natural substrate of the stream and is stable, because you don't want it to wash out of your crossing structure. Here they are again, the 4 S's. If you follow these rules of thumb, you will meet the golden rule, which is to let the stream act like a stream. Remember, we're now trying to think of road stream crossings as a road crossing a functioning stream, as opposed to water being pushed through the road. So we've got concepts that we want to aim for to create a Stream Smart crossing, but how do you go about it? What are the steps? How do you actually design a Stream Smart crossing? Well, there are 2 basic steps to get you started. The field assessment, where you collect the data and all the information that you need, and then the project design, where you plug the data in and come up with your design. But we need to start by asking some basic questions so that we know our goals. You need to start by figuring out the volume of flow that you're designing this for. Traditionally, culverts were sized to meet 25-year flows. Folks are moving away from that, and some regulations require you to go beyond that. So ideally, you want to be designing to meet a 100-year storm event. That's the flow you want to aim for. That will protect your infrastructure for the long haul, and it will make sure that you have the capacity for storms, and it will allow for fish and wildlife passage. We also want to think about what species we have in the system. Is this project going to benefit fish passage? Are there other species we need to be thinking about that are of interest in the area? And this is a great time to reach out to your local natural resource agency, like the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They can tell you what fish are in the system, if this is an important fishing resource, if there's habitat for stateless species or other targets as well. Communicate with your natural resource agencies. If you are putting in a Stream Smart crossing, they want to help you do it. They will provide you with information to help you do that. In addition to talking to agencies, there are other tools you can use to gather information before you actually go out in the field and to understand what's going on at your site. And one of them is the Mainstream Habitat Viewer. Over the last 13, 14 years, a number of the Stream Smart partners, led by the Nature Conservancy, have been going out, hiring field crews every season to go to every crossing in the state and survey it, take measurements, and evaluate it for its ability to pass fish. The public crossings from that effort, we've got 90% of the crossings in the state done, which is more than any other entity has, any other state, any other province. The public crossings are then posted in this habitat viewer, and they're color coded. So the red dots are crossings that are barriers to fish. The orange dots are ones that are barriers to some kinds of fish at some times of year, either at high flow spring events when the water is moving too fast, or at low flow later in the year when there isn't enough water moving through. The green dots obviously are the ones that are not barriers to fish passage at all. You can zoom into your town of interest and find the culvert that you're looking for. You can change the base maps from a map to an aerial photograph. And when you find your crossing, if you click on it with your mouse, it opens up a pop-up that is filled with all sorts of information that you can scroll through. This includes photographs of the inlet, the outlet, upstream, downstream, and some estimates of size and types of crossing, ownership, etc. Over on the Layers tab on the left-hand side, you can use that to find information on the natural resources in the area by, for example, turning on where the critical habitat for Atlantic salmon is, or where habitat for alewives is documented, or where we have brook trout habitat, among other things. For crossings that haven't been measured or where the site-specific data are missing, or if it's a private crossing but it's near another public crossing, you can use the same map to zoom into the area where you know the crossing is, and you can still gather information on the natural resources. You won't have the survey-specific data, but you can get some of that natural resource data for the area in question. The Advanced Search tab on the left-hand side allows you to pull all the crossings within your town or watershed into a table that can then be exported into Excel or as a KML files so that you can bring them into GIS, or CSV files actually. You should also check out StreamStats for your site before you head out into the field. You can get an idea of the size of the watershed that flows through your crossing structure. There's also an estimate of the bankful width. Don't rely on that number. They're estimates created through software models, and they're really not terribly accurate, particularly for smaller streams, but it can give you a general idea of what to expect when you get out there. The viewer also has estimates of bankful widths using a different model. So those numbers should again just be used to give you an idea of what to expect. You have to collect data. You have to actually measure the stream to develop your StreamSmart design. And that's what you do next. We've done our preliminary work, we've done our desktop work. Now we actually need to go out into the field and collect data. In the field, you're going to start collecting the data that you need to create that longitudinal profile where you'll get your slope and you'll get your elevation. But you need to collect all those points along the stream. But you have to remember that the crossing structure itself affects what you're going to find near that culvert. It's going to sort of mess it up. So you're going to need to move away from that structure. You don't want to take all your measurements right near the crossing structure because it's been altered and affected, and you're not going to get a true picture of what that stream is supposed to look like. You're going to get a picture of what that stream looks like when it's been impacted. So you need to get away from that crossing structure. And the rule of thumb is to go 20 to 30 times the width of the stream in distance away from the crossing. So for example, if you had a 10-foot wide stream, because you're going to measure that, get your actual bankful width. You have a 10-foot wide stream, you're going to have to go 200 to 300 feet down the stream and measure, and up the stream and measure. And that will give you a representative reach, an area that is unimpacted by that crossing structure, to take your measurements and get a good slope and get a good elevation. And you're going to collect a lot of measurements all the way through your crossing structure. And if you take good measurements in stretches outside the influence of that crossing structure, you can create a good design. This is a bit of an extreme example where there's extensive sedimentation, both up and downstream of the culvert itself. The old way would be to look right around the culvert and decide what your elevation and your slope is. If you do that in this example, you will simply continue the problems that this site had for decades. You're not going to be fixing the problem at all. Even if you made a bigger crossing structure, you're still setting your slope and your elevation wrong. What you need to do is go all the way out to where an unimpacted reach was found above and below, and look at what the true slope and the true elevation is for this crossing structure, for this site. You can see it's a very, very different slope and elevation than you got if you looked just near the crossing structure. You'll also need to look at the cross section of the stream, not just up and down, but across as well, and look at the cross-sectional area. Again, we want to not be taking these measurements right near the culvert, so you're going to want to do that down in the representative reaches, both up and downstream, so that you're getting a really good picture of what's actually happening in an unimpacted stream. When you do this, you need to pay attention and make sure that when you're taking a cross section that you pay attention to any major tributaries that are coming in, and make sure that you capture all of that, that you're not measuring before those tributaries come in if you're up above, or after or down below. So you really want to make sure that you're getting a representation of the cross section of the actual stream that's going to flow through your new crossing structure. And with these measurements, you can actually map out the cross section of the stream and look at it on a map for use in your calculations. And finally, you're going to want to characterize the substrate, because you're going to want to recreate that stream bed inside your new crossing structure. You want to get a feel for the distribution of the different sizes and types of substrate materials so that you can recreate that inside your structure. So now you've done all the legwork, you've done all your field work, you've collected data on your actual stream, and now you're going to go back inside and do your project design, your preliminary project design. You're going to take your data and you're going to start plugging it into some software, or into even just a graph paper, and start getting a feel for your stream. And so you also want to go back to StreamStats and do a hydrologic analysis so that you can understand what flows to expect at your crossing, now that you have the information to help you determine what size crossing. There are a number of different ways to do it, but StreamStats is the easiest. It's put out by USGS. It's online, it's free, it's pretty straightforward, and it does a pretty good job. It just spits out your the statistics that you need. And once you know how much water is flowing through your crossing, you'll need to test the capacity with some hydraulic modeling to see, if you look on the left-hand side of this table, what the discharge is going to be at different, a 100-year event versus a 25-year event. HYE is sort of the standard these days. It's developed by the Federal Highway Administration, and it can tell you and show you how your design will perform under these various flows: a 25-year event, 50-year event, 100-year event. And there are a lot of different options you can use to put in your StreamSmart crossing. You can choose the best one that fits your site and your budget. There are bridges, there are arches, three-sided boxes, embedded culverts. There are a lot of different options. You can make that determination as long as you are, again, meeting those 4 S's and being true to your data. You have different options that you can use for each site. With embedded culverts, you do need to remember that because you are going to fill about 1/3 of it at the bottom, you need to increase the size so that you don't lose the capacity that you need for that. And this graph just shows a comparison of the costs for 3 different crossing structures over time. I know that a lot of folks sort of stick with replacing a small culvert with a small culvert because it's cost effective. Or it seemed cost effective. It's cheap. You can do it quickly and easily. But you really need to be thinking about it for the long haul, and the costs over time really do add up. That undersized culvert is going to require more maintenance costs, and that's why the blue line here is a traditional undersized or small pipe. Over time, you're going to actually have to do maintenance on that, whether it's clearing debris, pulling out beaver material, adding more fill to keep the culvert in place. Over time, you're going to have to be doing some maintenance work on that, and that costs. And then again, those undersized culverts are not going to last as long. So you'll have replacement costs over time as well that you won't have with the more expensive alternative. It's expensive up front, but over time it's actually cheaper. So this was actually a study that the Nature Conservancy did, and they compared traditional pipe to an arch structure and a box structure, and the three costs, the upfront costs, were dramatically different. But at the end of 50 years, the small traditional pipe was more expensive over time, and you don't have the same public safety issues with the stream smart crossings that you would be having with that high maintenance small pipe. So that's a lot. I threw a lot at you in a fairly short period of time. So for the rest of this, I really just want to walk you through some examples and show you some real life examples of stream smart crossings, sort of before and after, some of the issues that came up in each of those projects. So this is a crossing that we've seen multiple times in this presentation already. We're looking downstream, and the little box in the upper left-hand side is the before picture. That's the undersized crossing that was replaced. And the red circle represents where that culvert was in the stream. So you can see it was high, the elevation was too high, it was above the stream bed, and it's too small for the size of this stream. The new crossing structure has a natural bed, it has the substrate needed. You can see the free flowing, the natural flow of the water, the elevation is appropriate, the slope is appropriate. The capacity is dramatically larger for those large storms, which we saw happened for this crossing structure. And in regular flow situations, you have dry banks inside that culvert, which not only shore up the footings, but also provide dry passage for wildlife, so they don't have to go up and over the road. This is a town road in the town of Phillips. It was a tiny 2.5-foot metal pipe that the road was constantly failing and overwashing, and they had a lot of maintenance issues and safety issues. They replaced it with a 3-sided concrete box or bridge. It was 12.5 by 4.5 feet, replacing a 2.5-foot metal pipe. It needed some more size. And because this pipe was so undersized and the elevation was so high, that there was a huge amount of sediment backed up behind this crossing when they took out the old pipe. And so they planned for a head cut, or that sediment bank basically to wash away and redevelop a natural stream bank. And within a year or two, without any disastrous effects, that sediment had moved through. And they have a perfectly lovely functioning stream smart crossing now. And here's a diagram of that, kind of like the last one, with the circle showing the size and location of that previous culvert. You can see how high it was compared to where the natural stream bed was, and how small it was compared to the natural stream width. So this shows the before and after in the same diagram. This is a town example in Whitefield, a town road. This was again a small metal pipe being replaced by, this time, a concrete arch. It was 11 by 5.5. This is a project that was partially funded through DEP's Culvert Grant Program. They got almost $75,000 to put towards this crossing structure. And you can see in the picture on the right that you have, again, seamless inlet and outlet. You have spanned the stream, they set the elevation right, the slope matches the stream, and there's substrate in that crossing structure. This is a perfect stream smart crossing. Here's another project that received funds from the DEP Culvert Grant water bond funds. And this one's a little bit different. It was, again, a metal pipe. It was perched. It was a barrier to fish. This is a brook trout stream. But because the substrate here was primarily clay, they did not have good soils to put those footers in, to put foundations in of a three-side, of an open bottom structure, because the clay is just too slippery. It's not strong enough. So they actually did an embedded pipe arch. So it's like a squashed culvert. It was 16.5 by 11 feet. They embedded it, so they filled about a third of it with natural substrate from the area in order to create this StreamSmart crossing, which spans the stream, has the elevation set appropriately, has the slope that matches the stream, and has substrate in it. It even has some dry banks on the inside, and is no longer a barrier to fish. This is an example of a project in Starks. This had two metal pipes that were skewed inappropriately in relation to the road. They were not aligned with the stream. They had multiple problems. The pipes were failing. You can see that they're perched. There's no way fish could get through these culverts. It's another project that was funded in part by the DEP Culvert Grant. With this project, they replaced it with a concrete arch, and what they found when they got there and started digging was there was ledge that they did not anticipate. So they had to be flexible and creative, and they were able to put in a great structure, but they had to make some changes on the fly and have some flexibility in moving money and equipment and people around to make it happen. Here's another project in Phillips. Again, a small metal pipe that had a couple of, with an overflow pipe set higher up. This road was failing. The culvert was failing, was falling apart. And they put in actually an embedded concrete box. So this is not a three-sided structure. This is embedded. And so they had to set it down low enough to be able to fill in a significant portion of the box with natural substrate, and then there are banks built on the sides. This was one that was a bit of an emergency project. Normal work window is July 15 through the end of September. That makes you work during the low or dry flow season, low or no flow. And it also was to protect any Atlantic salmon in the area or brook trout or other species. But because it was an emergency, they had to work outside that window with appropriate permission from the regulating agencies. And there was still so much water that they actually had to create a bypass channel to handle the flows during construction. So this was one that was a bit more difficult of a project, but it came out fantastic. They were again able to be flexible. They worked closely with the regulators and with all the agencies that required it. Which brings us to some of the things that we need to think about when we're designing and installing these StreamSmart crossings. You really want to have all your ducks in a row. You really want to have as much information up front. You don't want surprises when you've got your equipment out on site. You want to start talking to your regulating agencies as early as possible. Again, if you're doing a StreamSmart crossing, they're going to want to help you. They're going to help guide you through the process. Make sure you know what's expected and that you have all your permits in hand before you get started. Understand your in-stream work window. Again, it's usually July 15 to September 30. You can occasionally get extensions for that, but it depends on the stream. Sometimes they will not allow for extensions. Make sure that you have everything ready to go so that you can get your work done in that window. That window puts you in the low flow or no flow time of year when you're going to have the least amount of water coming through, hopefully, but there may still be water in your crossing area. You need to control that water during construction. That can be by pumping it around the work area or with a bypass channel, like we just saw in the last example. There are ways to control the water, but it is not something to take lightly, and it is something that you should have a plan for. Along the same lines, you need to pay attention to your sediment and erosion control. And along with that, with the weather, make sure that you're not opening up the ground right before a torrential downpour. Make sure that you know what's coming, you have good sediment and erosion control, and that you have lots of extras for that inevitable, unexpected storm. Make sure you have extra silt fence. Make sure you have extra pumps for the water control, because you don't want to be searching for that stuff in the middle of a torrential downpour when you have the ground opened up. When you are embedding a structure like the box structure in Phillips or the embedded squashed pipe in New Gloucester, you really want to understand how to build your stream bed and your banks to do it appropriately. You need to, the last thing you want to have happen is to go to all the work of putting that substrate in there and have it wash out. You need to make sure it's going to stay put, that it matches what is in the natural stream bed, and that it's built appropriately and to match the existing stream bed. And that's true for any crossing structure. Actually, you want to make sure that your stream bed and your banks are built appropriately. Bedrock and unstable soils, do your legwork ahead of time if you can. Make sure you take a look at the soil maps, where they're available to the detail that you need. You may need to do geotechnical bores. You want to know as much as you can about that site. You don't want to have a plan and then have to throw it out the window because you hit ledge or it's all clay. Have a really good understanding of your site. And one of the other problems that often comes up in collecting our data for these stream crossings is an inability to actually find an undisturbed reference reach, right? Where you go 200 feet from your crossing and maybe there's another culvert. So now you're in the influence of that culvert, or there's a tributary, or now you go into a large river, or the topography changes dramatically. It can sometimes be kind of difficult to find the undisturbed reference reaches that you need to collect good data. Just collect as much as you can, do the best that you can, and confer with others and get some agreement on what the best way to move forward is. For more information on StreamSmart, you can go to our website at streamsmartmaine.org, and you will find all sorts of information, including videos, handouts, PowerPoints, links to other resources, and also listings of any upcoming workshops. So if you're interested in doing the 2-day training where you actually learn how to take the measurements, or if this is your first introduction to StreamSmart and you want to start with an introductory workshop, you can do that as well. They will be posted on the website. And finally, I want to thank you. Thank you for sitting through this. And this is my contact information. If you have questions, go to streamsmart.org first, because there's a ton of information there. But feel free to reach out, and I hope to see you at the next workshop or out in the field putting in some StreamSmart crossings. Thank you.